Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, hell places, wherever you may be, and listeners to my podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in once again. I bring to you today yet another one of my Vietnam interviews conducted in 2014, this time with a gentleman called Gary Linderer, who has been author of several books regarding the Vietnam War, in particular the unit that he served in, the Specialist Unit. Very insightful, very meaningful, and hard-hitting books. Obviously, it's a hard-hitting war. Gary served with the 101st Airborne LRRPs, the Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol, also with F Company 58 before they became the 101st Airborne, and also L Company 75th Rangers, the same battalion, obviously just changing names throughout the war, so he served with three various versions of it. Today I bring to you Gary Linderer. Thank you very much. This interview has been held today with Gary Linderer. Gary served as a LRRP with F-58th LRRP Company in Vietnam in 1968, which then changed its designation on the 1st of February 1969 to L Company 75th Rangers. LRRP, LRP, stands for Long Range Patrol, later known as LRRP, Long Range Reconnaissance Patrol. These guys used to get dropped behind enemy lines and spend days and weeks on patrol, holed up, watching and reporting on the NVA and Viet Cong movements, or in fighting patrols where they were designed to hit quick and hard and cause max casualties. The activation of Company F 58th Infantry occurred in the Republic of Vietnam on the 10th of January 1968. The personnel comprising it were drawn largely from two sources: the cadre of Fort Campbell's renowned Recondo School, who had arrived in country during the 2 previous months, and personnel from the 101st Airborne Division's 1st Brigade's Long Range Reconnaissance Platoon. Thus the personnel were well trained and suited to perform their assigned mission of conducting long-range patrols. However, because the 101st Airborne had just recently arrived in country and had faced the monumental job of establishing itself, both in a semi-permanent location and as well as a functioning fighting team, Company F, better known as the Division LRRPs, were called on to perform numerous functions other than long-range patrolling, and it wasn't until 4th of May 1968 that the first long-range patrol was conducted. On 5th of December 1968, the Chief of Staff United States Army approved the activation of the 75th Infantry as the parent regiment for all departments of the Army Long-Range Reconnaissance Patrol units, and the designation of Ranger was also, rather than LRRP, was also provided. On the 1st of January 1969, the 75th Infantry, the famous Merrill's Marauders from World War II, were restored to the active roles of the US Army as a parent regiment under the Combat Army Regimental System, serving the Republic of Vietnam. During 1969, the company conducted 310 long-range patrols, almost twice the number of the previous year, accounting for 21 enemy killed and a larger undetermined number killed and wounded from supporting fires of gunships, artillery and TAC air directed by the teams. The enemy was visually encountered and observed by patrols in as many as 100 occasions. Teams directed the fires of gunships and artillery as many 200 times throughout the year. In addition to the visual sightings, the company's teams continue to provide the division with an immeasurable amount of information concerning enemy movements and concentrations, along with a vast amount of terrain information such as LZ, landing zone locations, water sources, etc. Gary himself served as a team leader and saw more than his fair share of combat. He's the author of several books on the subject, where he's also interviewed his teammates who have had their stories told. I highly recommend these books, including 6 Silent Men and Eyes Behind the Lines. Details of them have all been passed to Mr. Clayton should you be interested in reading them. I've known Gary for around 10 years and one day will be very honoured to finally meet him. His kindness and generosity shown towards me and my Living History Group I set up were very humbling. Gary was instrumental in the setting up of the Welcome Home reunion for the veterans of L Company and the LRRPs of the 101st Airborne, and every year he's organised the reunion for these guys in his hometown of Branson, Missouri, where everyone meets up to share a drink, or many, and catch up with their brothers and their families and remember those who never came home and who remain on eternal patrol in the jungles of Vietnam. Gary, finally, good afternoon, and firstly may I on behalf of Mr. Clayton and the Macaulay Catholic High School in Doncaster thank you for being kind enough to agree to take part in this interview. It's extremely appreciated and the students have shown a great interest in hearing your stories. Before I get on to the questions asked by the students, would you be kind enough to give yourself a short overview, a brief synopsis, so to speak, of what your role in the Vietnam War was? Over to you.
Go over that again, Chris. I missed it.
Oh, sorry, that's fine. Can you give a short synopsis of what your role was in the Vietnam War? Just a brief overview.
Yeah, do you want a short synopsis of my view of it?
I'll be asking those questions. Ask what was your role in Vietnam? What did you do out there? Basically who you are, what you did, who you served with, that kind of thing. How long you were there for?
I was there for a year, from June of 1968 to June of 1969. I was an enlisted soldier, not a draftee, and when my time was up, I still had 18 months left of active duty, and I went ahead and decided to come home rather than to extend, like a lot of the guys that were drafted were doing. Many of the draftees extended for an extra 3 to 6 months and got an early out of the service. But the guys that had enlisted, that wasn't available to us.
Right, okay. It's very interesting. I know, as I say, I know more from reading your books and everything. As I say, we've got some questions here which will help steer us in the way we're going to go. These are all directed directly from the students themselves, so I'm sure they'll be quite interested to hear the answers to these. So we'll go through them in chronological, so bear with me. So you've already answered the first one, which is how long you were there for. The second one, did you believe in what you were fighting for in Vietnam?
Yes, I did, and I still do. I think we were over there to help a nation that was, even though it wasn't a democracy as we know it here in the States, they were still, it was set up as a democracy, even though there were some corrupt leaders at the time. And the purpose of us going over there was to keep a communist country from rolling over South Vietnam and converting it to communism. During this period of time, almost all of Indonesia was falling to the communists, and the purpose of the American soldiers going over there was to prevent that from happening. I think they called it the domino effect back then, and there was a big fear that if South Vietnam fell and Thailand fell, Indonesia and eventually the Philippines would also fall to communism. So I do think we were there for a good reason. Communism did not continue spreading after the Vietnam War ended, except for South Vietnam falling to it. Indonesia and the Philippines was still protected from falling to the communists. And I think the Vietnam War had a lot to do with that.
That's very true, actually, because it stopped in Vietnam. It didn't spread any further out there. How did your attitude change throughout the war and throughout the time you were over there?
Well, I was there at the height of the Vietnam War in 1968 and 69. I got there right after the Tet Offensive of 68, which basically destroyed the Viet Cong. The year I was there, we saw a big increase in North Vietnamese soldiers coming into South Vietnam, and that's basically what my unit fought against. I never saw Viet Cong the entire time I was in Vietnam. We fought nothing but North Vietnamese soldiers who were well trained, well armed, and well motivated. And there were some large pitch battles there in 68, 69, and 70. The North Vietnamese suffered some heavy casualties, but so did the American forces. And right about the time I left Vietnam in 69, the government was doing what they were calling Vietnamization. They were trying to turn the bulk of the fighting over to the South Vietnamese, and with the Americans taking more of the support role. And that continued through late 1969 and 70 and 71. Even though there were still a couple of pitched battles, such as Hamburger Hill and Lam Son when we invaded Laos. The bulk of the activities after that was mainly small units such as Ranger teams and Special Forces teams that were trying to locate the enemy so that airstrikes and artillery could be called in on them. But the large infantry battles that were more representative of 68 and 69 started petering out in 70 and 71.
Okay, great. So I know I remember saying where you fought it was mainly the NVA, and I know from speaking to yourself and other people as well, it goes the difference between the two was immense. The
Well, to
NVA,
give you an example, Chris, my unit suffered its worst casualties in 70 and 71 because the recon teams in the ranger units were being used more like infantry platoons. Their mission was to go out and make contact with the enemy so that the American forces could pile on and bring in airstrikes on these large enemy units. But the American infantry was no longer used in pitched battles in 70 and 71. So because of that, the smaller units suffered a lot of casualties in the later part of the war.
Yeah, that's yeah. I mean, using a small unit as a main infantry unit, it's just not right, especially with you weren't designed for that at all. Okay, moving on with that. How did you actually feel about the draft? You were actually an enlisted man, and the draft brought young guys in, especially later in the war as well. They were. How did you, especially in the sort of special units that you were in, feel about draftees coming in as replacements?
About 2/3 of the men in my unit when I was there were enlisted. They had enlisted for 3-year terms of enlistment, and about 1/3 were draftees. But again, a lot of the guys had volunteered for the draft, so they weren't drafted against their will. A lot of the guys in my unit had volunteered for the draft rather than be enlisted, which gave them a 2-year tour of duty instead of a 3-year term of enlistment. So I don't want to take anything away from the guys that were drafted because they were just as motivated as the ones that are enlisted.
Okay, great. That's great.
And, the ones in our unit were good soldiers. A lot of them, almost all of them, were airborne qualified. Besides that, even though they were draftees.
Right. Okay. So yeah, that gave them the extra ability and the extra professionalism as well, getting through that airborne training, which really focuses you as well. Just looking through, seeing which ones we've answered and which we haven't here. How did you? I mean, obviously you've not met the Viet Cong, so how did you feel about the NVA and their tactics? I guess they scared you at times with the way they could actually infiltrate in and use the jungle the way they did.
The NVA?
Yeah, the NVA.
Well, I tell you, we respected them. They were good soldiers. They weren't as bloodthirsty or as devious as the Viet Cong were. They fought like we did. They fought in platoon-sized teams. They were very well trained and well armed. I know I talked to guys that were there before me that fought against the Viet Cong, and they said it was frustrating fighting the Viet Cong because it was usually hit and run, and the Viet Cong would not stay and fight because they didn't have very much ammunition. So they would ambush and fire a magazine or two and leave. And the NVA, on the other hand, they had plenty of ammunition, and when we made contact with the NVA unit, they very seldom ran. They would stay and fight us until we either defeated them by either superior firepower or calling in airstrikes or artillery and driving them away. But they were a worthy foe.
Yeah, everything I've read and everything I've talked about, it does lead up to that. So with the Viet Cong then, with their hit and run tactics, was that frustrating? The way they could just go in and dive straight in and then dive out again and disappear.
Well, there were two kinds of Viet Cong elements earlier in the war. There was the local guerrilla units, which might have consisted of 30 or 40 local BC that protected a certain area and never fought units larger than a platoon or a company. And then there were the main force Viet Cong units that even operated in battalion and regimental size. They were a little bit better armed, a little bit better organized, and actually fought quite a few pitched battles against both American forces and Australian forces and South Vietnamese forces. They were virtually wiped out during Tet of 68, and except down in the Mekong Delta area, in the very southern part of South Vietnam, the BC weren't very active anymore after Tet of 68. It was almost all NVA after that.
Okay, thank you. I didn't really realise that it was after '68. It was mostly NVA. What did you actually feel about the Vietnamese people themselves and the fact you know the actual not the Viet Cong, the normal Vietnamese people, the villagers, the farmers? How did you feel about them and the what and that you couldn't actually, sometimes you wouldn't be able to tell if they were Viet Cong or not?
Where I was stationed in the northern part of South Vietnam, most of the outlying villages had been brought into safe areas around Hue and Phu Bai. Most of the villages back in the mountains had been abandoned, or the people were moved in towards the city so they could be controlled and protected. So my dealings with the people, most of the rural villagers, just wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to deal with the Americans or anybody else. The people in the cities, like Hue and Saigon and places like that, they saw the Americans as a source of income, and a lot of those people spoke a little English and enough to get by anyway. And they made a lot of money selling cigarettes and black market items and cold sodas and things like this to the American troops along the roadside. They had little stands and kiosks everywhere along the highways. Where I was stationed, we were forbidden to go into the city of Hue. It was a protected city, and the commander of the 101st Airborne Division didn't want any American soldiers going in there, even though a lot of guys snuck in there when the opportunity presented itself. But even along Highway 1 going towards Hue, there were all kinds of little stalls where you could stop and buy Vietnamese goods and especially cold sodas, because we couldn't get cold sodas in the company area. The Vietnamese owned the ice plant, so we couldn't get ice. So if you wanted a cold soda, you had to buy it from the Vietnamese.
It doesn't sound like communism. That sounds like capitalism to me, making the money where they can.
Yeah. Well, we built the ice plant farm in the city of Hue. So I mean, we built that for them.
Oh,
And then
okay.
they would take patty water and make these big large blocks of brown ice, and they'd sell them to us for $5 a block. And that was a lot of money back then.
Oh yeah, definitely. Hearts and minds as well, isn't it? Because yeah, they're making the money, and they're from the American guys who are coming in. Okay, moving on to something I think a bit more towards the larger scale of two of the most famous sort of names of weaponry to come out. What did you think of the use of Agent Orange and Napalm? Did you think it was justifiable in your eyes?
I had nothing against the use of napalm. It was very effective. It was excellent at breaking contact, and it saved a lot of American lives. Agent Orange, there were a lot of ambushes along the highways over there, and the government came up with this defoliant spray, which we called Agent Orange, which killed all the vegetation along the major highways, and they would usually spray that so that there was just clear cover, maybe 400, 500 meters back away from the highways. This prevented the enemy from getting right up to the highways and ambushing convoys as they went past. My unit used to go into areas. We'd send a 6-man team into an area that had been sprayed 2 or 3 days before, and our job was to go in and find out if their enemy had been in that area that had been sprayed. They would always leave after the defoliation spray, because everything would usually die within 2 days. And we'd go in there and find out what was exposed by the vegetation falling to the ground. I remember several times drinking out of the streams in the area and brushing the dead leaves aside to get to the water. And I remember our government told us that the spray was harmless to humans and it would have no impact on us. So we tromped around in the jungle right after it had been sprayed and drank the water that contained the spray. You could even see a film on the water, but we didn't think it would hurt us. So we filled our canteens with it and put a halazone tablet in and drank it.
Right, okay. I say it's in hindsight, isn't it, really, when you're looking at stuff like that, that kind of defoliation spray and what damage it's done in the long term. The views on napalm seem to be justifiable, and a broad opinion of everyone in the fact that it was it worked for what it
But
did.
we've lost a lot of vets with cancer and diabetes and different kind of problems that have been attributed to Agent Orange. And it's hard to believe that 2/3 of the people that served in Vietnam are dead already. There's only 1/3 of us left.
I know that's shocking. It's the statistics are actually appalling when you look at it, and it's not hitting them until 15, 20 years down the line sometimes. So it just out of nowhere it comes. It's a very, very nasty thing.
Well, it's tragic when you think about it, because I mean, most of the vets that we've lost with symptoms of Agent Orange died in their 30s and 40s and 50s, which is very early for anybody to die. I mean, the World War II vets have lasted longer than we've lasted. And I know a lot of the guys in my unit, we've lost over half the guys that served in my unit in Vietnam are gone already, and many of the others are sick. And they're in their 60s, and they're suffering from all kinds of maladies right now.
Yeah,
myself included.
Well, yeah, I know all the things that you've been going through and that you've had done. It is shocking how much it has affected. It's an entire generation of you guys who are out there. I can't put into words how upsetting it is to know that something like that has caused so much when you guys went out and gave your all for the country and for freedom out there. It's beyond words. Okay, moving on.
Chris, I think most of us still believe in the war, though. I talk to guys at reunions, and I've never run into a guy from my unit that regretted what we did over there. So, I mean, there's a lot of pride and brotherhood among Vietnam vets, and very, very few of them are ashamed of why we went over there or what we did when we were there.
Oh no, you should be proud of what you've done. You went out there for a job, and what you've done, as you say, if you do look at it in that way, then communism didn't go any further than Vietnam. That's what you were out there to do, and you did your job, and you came back. And that's, you should be proud of what you've done. You've served your country. That's more than a lot of people that nowadays can say they've done. So it's an absolute honour to even know you in that respect.
I'll tell you a side benefit that a lot of us realize. The vets today and in the last 10 or 15 years have been treated like royalty in this country. And I mean, just all kinds of things have been done for them, and they've been supported by both Democrats and Republicans and conservatives and liberals. And I think the reason that they're being treated so well is our country is ashamed of the way they treated the Vietnam vets. So they're bending over backwards to make sure they don't do that to vets again. And that makes what we went through worth it.
Yeah, it has been. I mean, it's the same in the UK, but it's definitely that in America. You can see that the way the veterans are being treated when they've come back from war, from the Gulf War I onwards, which actually brings us right into these questions as well, which is perfect. How did you feel about coming home from Vietnam? Were you surprised by the reaction of the public to Vietnam and to the veterans when they came home? I mean, I've spoken to you, and I know through our friends Kit and Heidi with a brother versus brother and all those stories, and I know from speaking to you what you've been through and what other guys have all been through when you came back. Would you just like to go through that yourself for the benefit of the pupils, just understand what it was like coming back into the hostile US to a certain extent?
I'll tell you, when I came back from my tour, I got married 2 weeks after I got back from Vietnam. And I was engaged when I went over there, and she wanted to get married before we went. But I didn't want to leave a young widow behind, so I made her wait till I got home. But then I had 18 more months to serve. And it was the toughest thing for me when I came home was I think nobody wanted to hear about what happened to me in Vietnam. Even the friends I had in high school and college, they just wanted to blow it off. They didn't want to talk about it. So I had to get out of character very quickly and change my whole attitude. And the worst part was losing contact with the guys I just left. I felt very guilty leaving those guys over there and coming home, almost to the point that I was afraid to get letters from guys still over there to find out if any of my friends died. and that was tough for me. I used to read the Stars and Stripes every week to read the obituary column to find out who was killed over there. Unfortunately, the first 6 months after I got home, we didn't suffer any more casualties in my unit. So all the guys I left behind, none of them died while after I got home. The next casualties that happened in L Company were replacements that I didn't know. So that was my biggest concern coming home, is guys I served with were going to die, and I wasn't there to help.
Yeah, that must be hard.
So I had a tough time adjusting to that. I guess you could call it survivor's guilt, but the war had a different impact on everybody. And some of my best friends over there, one particular, John Size, has never come to a reunion and won't talk about Vietnam. He lives about an hour from me right now, and I haven't seen him in 30 years. And even though we talk on the phone, he does not want to talk about Vietnam.
My God, you're right. It's different. People have different effects from it, and the way you would like to talk about it. I mean, I guess some people just, as you say, just want to forget their time over there. But I mean, it must be so hard, as I say, when you've come back as well, and you've got your friends, your brothers that you've been out there with, and you're the one back in the States. They're still out there. I can't understand it because I've not been in that situation, but I can empathise with how that must feel.
Yeah. My unit was one of the first units after the Vietnam War to actually get back together and have a reunion, which we did in 1986. And, we've had a reunion every year since then. And, we get a lot of guys that it's been 15 years after we start having reunions, all of a sudden there'll be 5 or 6 new guys show up at a reunion. And once they show up, almost all of them will never miss another one. And yet, they even say, "God, I wish I'd have come to the first reunion," because we're like a big family and we support each other. And we've had a few guys that committed suicide, and we've helped guys out of committing suicide. Thank God, a few of them have had enough sense to call somebody before they pull the trigger, and we've stopped a number of suicides among our group. But it's still tragic that so many of our guys have killed themselves or just crawling into a shell and drank themselves to death. That's happened with a lot of them.
Yeah, and it is a tragedy. I know that's something of the Vietnam War generation that I've noticed, probably because of the way I've been looking into it, is the fact that you do all stick together, you do all support each other, you've got that whole network behind you if you need it to speak to. And that must be such a comforting thing to know when you've got them all there. Right, I've left this question till the end for you, Gary, and because I think it's going to be probably a tough one, because I know what I'm going to ask. One of the questions was, which battles were you in and were you afraid? Now, the one I'd like you to say, because I think it's the one I know you're most famous for from the books that you've read and through Kit's and Heidi's blog that we are very active in about 10 years back, and that is the Range Reconnaissance battle. The one I think you briefly touched on it earlier as well. Would you like? Can you just give I know it's quite impossible to say a brief synopsis of what kind of happened there. Just the feelings that you went through in that battle, in that situation that you were in, if you don't mind.
You're talking about the November 20th mission?
Yeah, that one. Is that something if you want to talk about it, don't talk about it. I'm not pushing you into that.
Well, it was a tough one for me. I lost my best friend and several other guys on that patrol. But basically what happened is I was roughly halfway through my tour, and my slot for Recondo School was coming up on the 23rd of November. And I was a Spec 4 at the time, and after Recondo School, I would have been promoted to buck sergeant. Once you got a slot to Recondo School, you pretty well were sure that you'd become a team leader, or at least an assistant team leader. So I had that to look forward to on November 23rd. And on November 19th, my team and another team were called in and given a flag report for a heavy team operation in the Run Valley. They suspected that the 5th NDA Regiment had infiltrated that area back in the mountains, and they wanted to send they sent two heavy teams, two 12-man teams, to find out if the 5th NBA Regiment was in that area. The reason they sent heavy teams is because it was a pretty good ways away from our base camp, and if we got into contact with particularly with this regiment, which was a highly trained and well-led regiment, if we got into contact with them, 12 men could hold out longer than 6 men could until reinforcements or gunships could get out to support us. So they sent two heavy teams in instead of the two 6-man teams. We went in at last light, 2 helicopters, and we went into a ravine that was full of elephant grass. And the first team went in, the other team, not my team, the first team went in and jumped into the elephant grass, and once the helicopter supports were right on top of the skids, were sitting right on top of the grass when the team jumped. And then once they hit the ground, they found that grass was 10 to 12 feet high. So when they jumped out, they actually dropped 10 to 12 feet before they hit the ground. Oh, we saw what happened, and when our helicopter came in, we actually hung from the skids and dropped it to get a little closer to the ground. And everybody made it, of the 12 guys, with the exception of John Sires, who landed on a teak log that was laying in the elephant grass and injured both of his ankles. We formed a circle in the grass, and the helicopters flew away, and the team there gave the signal to go move into the jungle, which was only about 20 meters from where we went into that ravine. As soon as we got into the jungle, there was a heavy trail about 3 meters wide, paralleling the ridge line that we were approaching. Actually, it was running just inside the jungle. It was running along the face of that ridge line. We stopped there immediately, and our team leader, Sergeant Contreras, sent 2 guys to the west and sent Frank Souza and I to the east to scout out the trail. And Souza and I went approximately, I'd say 30 meters and ran into a trail watcher's bunker right at a bend in the trail where the trail bent and went up the ridge line to the top of the ridge. And we saw that the trail watcher's bunker was empty. So we went around that bend and started climbing up the ridge line. And we went about maybe 30, 40 feet. We heard a single shot about 150 meters away from us. And realizing it was a signal shot that they had heard us come in, the enemy had heard us come in, we moved back down to the rest of the team and reported what we had heard and what we'd found. Our team leader says, okay, we know there's enemy in the area, and look for a place to set up an ambush. Well, when we had made that bend and started climbing up the ridge line, right at the top of the ridge there was a knoll to the left of the trail that was a little bit higher than the trail, and then the trail made a turn to the right and went down the top of the ridge line. And we reported to the team leader that this would be a good spot for an ambush because it was a little higher than the trail, and it was also on a bend of the trail where we could watch enemy troops approaching before they got into the kill zone. So we moved up there right at dark, and I think we set out 6 claymores, if I'm not mistaken, right along the edge of the trail and camouflaged them. And then we were approximately 15 feet behind the claymores on a little bit higher ground. We set up in a circle on top of that knoll with rear security looking out the back way, and I think there was 6 of us lined up along the ambush site. Well, that night, the enemy sent several patrols down that trail with lanterns and flashlights looking for us. So we knew that they knew we were in the area. Mm-hmm. I think there were at least 4 patrols that passed us that night, shining lights, but they never saw us. The next morning, John Sires had taken off his boots after he got up on top of the hill. His feet had swollen so much that he couldn't get his boots back on, and I think we realized then he had broken both of his ankles. And the team leader said, well, let's call for a medevac extraction and get him out of here. So Riley Cox and Frank Souza took John back down to the LZ we had come in on, and a helicopter came in and dropped a McGuire rig, and they put John in the McGuire rig and they lifted him out and flew him back to the hospital at Dubai. Those two guys came back up rejoined the team, so there was 11 of us still on the ground, and no sooner than they had gotten back to the team than a single NBA came walking down the trail. Instead of blowing the ambush on that one individual, Sergeant Gutierrez decided to let him pass, and hoping for a bigger unit coming by so we could get a bigger kill when we blew the ambush. It wasn't too long after that guy passed us that we heard talking down the ridge line, and Gutierrez alerted everybody to get ready to blow the ambush. And I was laying in the position to blow the first Claymore mine on the ambushers. 9 NBA came down the trail, and as they passed us, I thought it was another LRRP team because they were dressed like we were. They had floppy hats on, and the first two guys had OD military uniforms like the South Vietnamese wore, and the 4 behind them were nurses, and they were wearing black pajamas and pith helmets.
Right.
But you could tell they were females. And then there was an NBA major behind the nurses, and then I think there were 2 other men behind the NBA major. And Contreras snapped his fingers, which was the sign to blow the ambush. And when I blew my Claymore, the other 5 Claymores went off simultaneously. And after the dust settled and the smoke cleared, we heard some moaning out in the trail. And Billy Walkabout and myself and Frank Souza started to get up, and at that time, the point man, who had gotten actually past the Claymore, we saw him running down the trail, and I fired a magazine over his head one-handed and missed him, and Frank Souza jumped up and fired a magazine at him, and the towel that the guy had around his neck fell off his neck, and he stumbled, so I know Frank hit him. And then Frank chased him down the trail, and the guy jumped back in the forest on the left side of the trail and headed back in the direction that they had come from. We 3 of us went down and checked all the bodies, and one of the women was still alive, but she was in such horrible shape that from the Claymore blast that she died pretty quickly. And we stripped all the bodies, and there was a canvas map case that was on the NBA major, and it was loaded with maps and documents and things like that, which we brought back to the center of the perimeter. And then we confiscated 2 AK-47s and 4 .45 automatic pistols. One was in the NBA major's holster, and we found 3 of them in the rucksacks with medical supplies that the nurses were carrying. They were American .45 automatics. So we brought all that stuff back up in the perimeter, and Contreras got on the radio and called and reported we just blew a successful ambush, and it killed, we killed 9 of the 10 people in the patrol, and the point man got away from us. So Contreras reported this, and I asked for a reaction force to come in and develop the situation. And we sat there in that position for almost an hour, and several of us went up to Contreras and said, "We need to move out of here. You know, we're right here next to the bodies, and you know, our guy got away and knows where we are. We need to move to a higher ground or a more defensible position." And he said, "No, we're going to wait here for the reaction force." At that time, we got a call on the radio, and it was reported that our helicopters had been requisitioned by a brigade commander for a combat assault that was going on, and we didn't even have our own helicopters, let alone helicopters to fly a reaction force out.
Charming.
So we were stuck. So at that time, Contreras told Jim Venable to go down into the saddle on the backside of the hill where there was a little opening in the trees, and our company commander was out flying around looking for our position, and he told Venable, when you see his helicopter, flash a mirror so they know where we are. As soon as Venable started flashing the mirror, an AK-47 opened up and dropped him in the saddle. and 4 of us on that side of the perimeter opened fire to suppress the NBA fire, and Cox and Frank Souza ran down and grabbed Venable and drug him back into the perimeter. He'd been hit in the neck and broke his arm, and was also hit in the shoulder.
God.
And about that time, we started getting assaulted by squad-size units of NBA from the direction of the trail where we had come in on, down below the hill, between us and the LZ. And we drove them back and killed several of them, and while Contreras was calling for a medevac to come in and pull Venable out. We got Venable out. There was 10 of us left on the ground, and we were kind of surrounded at that time on 3 sides. We kept drawing fire from 3 different locations. The only location we did not draw fire from was the north side, and there was a steep cliff there on the back side of the ridge. On the back side of the knoll, there was a real steep cliff. So we only had one guy over there pulling security. The other guys were spread around the perimeter. We called for gunships and artillery both. We got artillery in first before the gunships arrived on the scene. And when the gunships arrived on the scene, we pulled the artillery off, and 4 Cobras came in and started firing up the area where the NBA were. We were popping smoke to mark our position.
Mm-hmm.
This went on for about an hour, and all of a sudden, Contreras told everybody, tighten up the perimeter. I'm going to bring the gunships in closer. And everybody started moving back to the very crest of the hill. I remember I was shinnying backwards, pulling my rucksack with me as I shinnied backwards. I remember looking at my best friend, Terry Clifton, next to me, and Frank Souza, and they were both up on their knees with their back to the enemy, throwing their rucksacks back up on top of the hilltop. And about that time, there was a horrendous explosion from the steep side of the cliff over there. And I remember this ball of smoke rolling across the top of the perimeter. I felt something hit me in the legs, and I couldn't see after that because of all the smoke and debris.
Okay.
When things cleared up, I looked around and there was nobody left upright. I mean, just a few minutes before that, there were 6 men that were either sitting or up on their knees, moving back to the top of the perimeter. And when that thing went off, there was nobody left up at all. Everybody was down.
Oh, my God.
My immediate thought was to shoot the wounded because I thought I was the only one left, and then to kill myself because we all had a pact. We didn't want to be captured by the NBA because they didn't like us. And about that time, Billy Walkabout said, "Where'd you hit?" And I turned around, and Billy was up on his knees. He'd been hit in both hands. And everybody else was still down. I saw Riley Cox sit up across the perimeter from me, and when he sat up, his intestines fell out in his lap.
Oh, God. And
Frank Souza, who had just been up, was face down on the ground, and I saw him roll over on his back. And I thought, well, he's still alive. I looked at Terry Clifton, and Terry was on his hands and knees then, and his throat had been ripped open. He was spewing blood out, and he reached for me, and like he was trying to say something, and then he went down. You know, he bled out so fast, it was amazing. Jim Bacon was on his back, and the team leader, Jim Bacon was the radio operator. The team leader was laying across Bacon's legs, and Mike Rife, who was the guy we put on the back side of the perimeter overlooking that cliff, was pinned against a tree. And Art Herringhausen behind me was dead. I could tell he was dead. And there was one other new guy on the other side of Herringhausen that had been hit in the bottom of both feet. And he was laying with his face down at the time. I thought he was dead too, but he was only wounded in the feet. After that, things happened pretty quickly. Walkabout and I crawled over to Frank Souza, and Frank was on his back, and we pulled his shirt open. There was a little bitty hole on the right side of his chest, and but it didn't look like a sucking chest wound, but that's what we thought he had. And we took a piece of plastic. I took a piece of plastic off of a radio battery, to put across the wound. We were going to try to seal it the way you treat a sucking chest wound. And when I rolled him over, he had a hole in his back as big as a basketball.
Oh my God.
The piece of shrapnel hit him in the chest just blew his whole right side of his right quadrant of his upper back out. I could look inside and see his lungs that was shredded inside of him. So there was no way to treat that for a sucking chest wound. So we laid him on a poncho, backside down, to keep the dirt out of the wound, and wrapped him in the poncho. And we went over to Contreras. He was hit above the left ear. The only piece of shrapnel that hit him, and it came out the top of his head, a small hole, but he was unconscious but still breathing. Bacon had a big chunk of meat about the size of my fist taken out right above his knee. We went over to Riley Cox. Riley's right arm was broken at mid-forearm, and his guts was in his lap. Plus, he was hitting the neck and the chest. But Riley was already firing down at the enemy actually was firing at that time with a 12-gauge shotgun, loading it one-handed and shooting it one-handed. And he said, "Just leave me be." He said, "Take care of the wounded." We went to Mike Rife and grabbed his arm, and his arm came out of his sleeve, and he was pinned to the tree. We couldn't even pull him off the tree.
Oh God.
One of the new guys, Steve Zaperny, that was hitting the feet, he came to and said, "I'm okay, just treat the others." Art Herringhausen was dead. Walkabout couldn't hold anything in his hands, but his legs were okay. His feet were okay. Bacon got on the radio after we pulled Contreras off of him and called for a ceasefire, because at the time he thought we had been hit by our own artillery. But our artillery was not firing at the time. We had Cobra gunships sitting over the top of us, firing down the hill around us. And then he thought a Cobra hit us, but there was a Cobra doing pedal turns right over the top of us. And there's no way a Cobra can stand on its nose and shoot straight down. So we realized later, when we saw the shrapnel that they pulled out of us, that we got hit by a Tricom Claymore, not friendly fire.
Right, okay.
And a Tricom Claymore is a 40-pound Claymore mine that's made from the bottom of a 55-gallon drum that's put on tripod legs and loaded with metal and rocks and glass and detonated. It's similar to our Claymores, but much larger. Okay. So we reckon what happened is the enemy crawled up that cliff behind us and set up that Claymore on the edge of our perimeter in the brush, and they knew exactly when to blow it. So they must have been watching, because they waited until everybody was up on their knees, moving back to the top of the perimeter when they blew that Claymore.
Oh my gosh!
And it took everything off the top of that hill. All the cover that was around us was gone. The trees that we couldn't hardly see the sky above us. When the Claymore blew, it opened up the whole perimeter above us.
Oh my gosh!
So we got Walkabout and I managed to get Sousa and Contreras medevaced. Every time a medevac came in, the enemy would open up on it. You could hear the bullets hitting off that medevac chopper. They dropped a jungle penetrator, and then the chopper drifted off the hilltop, and the jungle penetrator would drift down towards where the enemy were. Twice Walkabout ran down that hill and wrapped his arms around that penetrator and carried it back up to the top of the hill. And with my hands and his legs, we managed to get two guys medevaced. We continued fighting. We couldn't get anybody else out after that. We continued fighting and picking up ammo from the dead and the wounded, and for about 2.5 hours. And just when we were about ready to give up, our company commander called us and told us that Meacham and Grant, two of our chopper pilots, had pulled out of that combat assault they were requisitioned for, and flew back to our company area and radioed ahead that they were coming back to get a reaction force. Anybody that wanted to come out and rescue us better be on the chopper pad. The whole company was down there ready to go. Those two choppers brought 23 Rangers out, or LRRPs, I should say. At the time we were LRRPs. They brought 23 guys on two choppers, which is heavily overloaded, and came out and dropped them off where we went in, and those guys came up that hill and rescued us. Oh, so that's how we got out of there. We ended up losing 4 guys killed and and 7 wounded out of 11 people. It was a nasty operation. Billy Walkabout and the team leader, Albert Contreras, both got Distinguished Service Crosses. Both were put in for Medals of Honor. And 7 of the remaining of us got Silver Stars, and everybody else got Bronze Stars with D's. And everybody got Purple Hearts.
Oh, God. I know. Sorry, I'm choked listening to it. I mean, I've read it, and it was, as I say, it was part of what I used to research 10 years ago, and I choked reading it, and listening to it's choked me even more. One thing I know, just so I can put it across to the students about how you all did stick together, is when those guys came to rescue you. Am I right in remembering that some of them turned up in their shower shoes? They were wearing shower shoes because they just rushed straight out the showers to grab their weapon.
Tony Tessero, he was supposed to go home the next day. And when the chopper pilots radioed in and asked for volunteers to be on the chopper pad, Tony had already turned in all of his gear and his weapon and everything. And he ran up to the supply tent and requisitioned an M16 and grabbed a bandolier of ammo. And he was in shower shoes and shorts when he ran down to the chopper pad. There was another guy whose arm was in a cast, and he jumped in the chopper. And the first guys that jumped in the chopper were pushed out the other side by the guys coming in behind them. And W.T. Grant, one of our chopper pilots, turned around and looked at Tony Tessero and said, "You're going home tomorrow. Get off this chopper now." And Tony stuck his M16 in the back of Grant's head and said, "Take off, sir. I'm not going anywhere." So those guys came out, and I mean, most of them only had their web gear, if they had anything at all, or a couple of bandoliers of ammunition. They didn't have time to get roughed up for that operation. Tony was one of the first guys that came running up that hilltop in his flip-flops and his weapon. And when he got to the top of the hill, he found out that the 7-magazine bandolier he thought he had was 7 boxes of loose rounds, not magazines.
Oh no!
So he didn't even grab magazines. He had 7 boxes of loose ammo. The only magazine he had was the one in his weapon.
Oh God!
And when those guys came running up the hill, they said there were NBA bodies everywhere, and parts of the hill was slick with blood. Not so much from the ones we killed, but from the choppers and the artillery that was brought in. They estimated there were 200-something bodies around that hill. And when they ran up to us, the NBA between us and where they came in, I don't know what they thought was going on, but they came running past us. Okay. And we could see their heads going past us when they were running up the trail, and they kept going. They didn't even stop to shoot at us.
Oh, God.
And we didn't fire back at them either. I Walkabout kept hollering, "We're up here, we're up here." And I kept telling him, "Shut up. They're going to know we're alive." And he just kept hollering. And the NBA didn't fire at us at all when they ran past us.
Oh, God, they must have been scared out of their wits as well. And they suddenly heard everyone coming in. But, I mean, I seen Tony coming up there in his shower shoes and flip-flops. It must have been a huge sigh of relief and a comical... Well, as bad as the situation was, it just sounds, just seeing him coming up must have just been an absolute sight for sore eyes. This guy and all of them coming in.
It was. I mean, seeing those guys, I remember when the first 3 of them ran into the perimeter, and we heard them coming up the trail. The first guy in was Tony Tessero with his flip-flops, and right behind him was Tim Coleman and Clint Wonderlick, and Clint had an M60 machine gun. And they immediately surrounded us and set up a perimeter around us. And then Tony and 2 of the other guys came over and started checking the wounded. And they wanted Riley to out first because Riley was injured the worst, and Riley refused to go. After he had emptied his shot up all of his shotgun ammo, somehow or another, he got a hold of some Mike Rice's Car-15, who was still firing towards the enemy with a Car-15. Keep in mind, he had stuffed his guts back in his stomach and stuck his towel that he had around his neck in the slit in his stomach to hold his guts in.
Oh my God.
And somehow or another got a handkerchief or a bandage and tied his broken arm back against the rest of his arm so it wasn't dangling. And he continued fighting for 2.5 hours, wounded like that.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's right. I'm actually speaking to Riley as well. Um, I've spoken to him before as well in the past. My son's actually middle name's named after Riley as well. One of the things, it's just I can't believe what he did. That's, as you say, it's like all of you that whole thing, what all of you guys have done, and what all of you guys went through is, as I'm
Well, Chris,
I'm
to this
choked at the
day,
moment.
Riley Cox should have got a Distinguished Service Cross too. I mean, for what he did. Keep in mind the only the only guys that could still fire was myself, Riley Cox, and Steve Zaperny, who was the guy hitting the bottom of the feet.
Uh-huh.
And the whole time that battle was going on, Steve was on the back side or the front side of the ridge, facing down the ridgeline where that trail had come from, guarding that area. And we never got hit from the top of the ridge, so he never had got to fire a shot. So the only one doing any firing was Riley and myself, and I couldn't do a lot of firing while we were medevacing two of the guys. I had to strap them on the penetrator.
Uh-huh.
After Walkabout brought it back to me. So Riley Cox is the guy that was keeping the NBA off of us.
My God, and doing that while he was using a towel to stuff his guts back in. Oh, it is, as I say, I mean, I know this story, and hearing it directly from you is just absolutely astounding. I really do thank you for saying it, and I know how hard it is to recite and go over things like that.
Chris, it was hard for me before I wrote the books to talk about that. And I came to the conclusion that, by God, there were so many heroes out there that day that somebody needed to talk about it. Billy Walkabout was never the same after that mission. It messed him up so badly. He became an alcoholic and a druggie when he went back to the States and died about 10 years ago, drank himself to death. John Sires, I guess he had such a horrible guilt complex because he wasn't there on the ground when we got hit with us. He'd already been medevac, but John won't even come to a reunion or talk about Nam anymore. Frank Souza, I thought had died, and I got a phone call from him about 15 years after Vietnam. I got a call from him, and he was over in Illinois and wanted me to come over and meet with him. And I said, "Who is this?" I said, "You're lying. Frank Souza is dead." I said, I looked at his back and saw his shredded lungs. I said, "You're lying. You're not Frank Souza." He had to actually go through stuff that happened to both of us over there before I would believe it was him.
Oh, God.
And then I drove over and spent 2 days with him in Champaign, Illinois, in a hotel room, reliving what we had gone through. But I had none of it. When they put us in the hospitals, they put us in different hospitals. So none of us ever realized what had happened to the other guys.
Yeah.
I was the only one to come back to the company besides John Sires. All the other guys were shipped back to the States, and we never got word if they lived or died.
Oh, God, that must have been must have been horrible not knowing. I didn't know that about Billy. I really didn't. I knew.
Yeah, we knew Contreras died because they flew him out to the repos, the hospital ship in Da Nang Harbor, and they couldn't save him. He had brain damage. He died the next day. Okay. But I knew Bacon was shipped to Japan, and they told me John Sires went to Japan. When they put me in the hospital, John Sires was in the next bed reading a newspaper. and I sat there and watched him read, and I said, "You going to say anything, Sires?" And he looked over, he said, "Jesus Christ, what are you doing here?" And then I had to tell him about what happened. He had no idea we had been hit.
Oh, God. Oh, my. Yeah, that's... I can see where he...
But I never heard what happened to Jimmy Venable. I never heard what happened to Ciperni. I never heard what happened. I knew Bacon got shipped to Japan is all. And I just came to the conclusion that Souza had died. And Walkabout, he was back in the company the next day with his hands patched, and he went home on an extension leave for 30 days the next day.
Oh, my God.
And he came back 50 days after. He was supposed to have a 30-day extension leave. He came back almost 3 weeks late. And because he was up for a Medal of Honor at the time, they didn't even say anything to him when he came back to the unit. But when he came back, his mind was so messed up, he never went out in the field again.
Oh, God.
They ended up shipping him down to Benoit, made him a recruiter down there. And from what I was told, for 6 months, all he did was stay high and get drunk.
Oh, such a shame.
So that mission ruined him.
Yeah, that's absolutely a shame. I'm shocked. I mean, well, if he's gone through that, I didn't realise he'd passed 10 years ago. He's one of the ones who've got the signature on my print that you were kind enough to take around as well. I had no idea about that. That's shocking.
It was a tough mission, I think, because I remember out there that day my fiance had given me a St. Christopher medal, and I remember holding it in my hands out there and praying and then finally putting it back around my neck and said, "I'm not coming out of this. There's just no way I'm going to survive this."
Yeah.
Because we were almost out of ammunition and grenades, and there was only 2 at the time. I didn't know Zaperni could still fire a weapon. I thought it was just Riley Cox, and I left. And when they told us, they couldn't get any reaction force out there, so they have to spend the night there. And that's what I decided. This was like 4:30 in the evening. I thought, there's no way we're going to survive the night. And then all of a sudden, Captain Eklund comes in on the radio and told us that Grant and Meacham, 2 of our pilots, were bringing a reaction force from the company out. And we still didn't think we'd survive long enough for them to get on the ground. And then when we heard those helicopters come in and drop those guys off, and we heard the shooting down there when the guys started running up the hillside, we saw the NBA running past us. I thought any minute they were going to see us and shoot us. So it was one of the, I told my wife after I had this surgery, I said, I've used up 6 of my 9 lives. 3 times in Nam and 3 times during surgeries after Nam. So I still got 3 left.
Let's hope they'll last a long time as well. All right. Okay. Is Gary? This is actually going to bring us to the end of this interview for the students. Is there anything that you'd like to say to the students of your own? Just any before we wrap it up?
The only thing I'd like to say to the students, and Great Britain has got their own proud military tradition, and something that you guys ought to be very proud of. I mean, we've been allies for years, and I have strong feelings for the British soldiers and also the Australian soldiers. I know several of them, and Jim Walker, Limey Walker, who was born in England, was 1st Brigade LRRP and a very good friend of mine before he died. I had a lot of respect for Limey too. We had 2 guys in the unit that were from England, believe it or not, and 3 from Canada. But my advice to the kids is honor your veterans, because they all made sacrifices for your country, and it's not over yet. They'll be making more sacrifices in the future. But honor them, and when they reach that age, don't be ashamed to serve in the military. It's a noble calling, and there's no other brotherhood like it.
Great, thank you for those words, Gary. As I know these students who will be listening to this, they are very, very respectful of the veterans that have served in the past.